In the example we've been working through, our new objects, our new classes, have all been within the context or the same file as our main program. In the real world, this would rarely happen. Apart from anything else, if you had all your classes within the same project file, you would end up with one huge, great big project file, and it would be very, very difficult to navigate. So what generally you do is, for each class, you would create a class file of its own. So what we shall do is we will move our myObject class and we'll move it into its own file. So within the Playground project, if we right click and we say add, and we can choose class. From our list that comes up, class is at the top, so we can simply overwrite it and let's call it myObject. So this creates by default a new class called myObject. If we simply take this code and cut it all out, and then we shall paste it in over the top. So now we've moved that entire class into a file of its own. Now you will see that the code still works exactly as before. As you can see, and that's because it is linked, because it's within the bounds of the same project, and something called the namespace is the same, which we'll go into later. It just knows that it's there. So it's just a way of breaking up our project and maintaining coherence. Now sometimes you want to actually have your objects in a completely separate project. Now the reason why you might want to do that is because you might want to write a series of classes that can be reused, so other applications may want to use them. Or perhaps you want to be able to break up the workload into individual maintainable projects. For example, many people might be working on a very large solution, and so you'll break the solution down into individual projects. Each bit of the project is responsible for its own functionality, and then the whole get brought in at a later date. So let's examine this a bit further. So instead of right clicking our project, Playground, we're going to right click our solution, and we're going to say add, and we're going to say new project. The other way we could do it is if we just went to the file menu and said new project. It does the same thing. The important thing is that the solution needs to be added to the solution. The project needs to be added to the solution as opposed to creating a new solution, and that will create it in our overall solution. So this one we're going to call my library. And what we're also going to do is, for the project type, we're going to call it a class library. So again, what we shall do is we shall go into my object and we shall copy all that into there. And what we shall also do, when you create a new project, it creates a basic class of its own. So we'll just rename that to what we want it to be, which is my object. The alternative way is, what generally people do is they delete that starter class and just create a new one. It doesn't really matter which way you do it. We'll save that, and then we'll delete the myObject file from there. In theory, we could have just copied that class straight in, but I'll explain in a minute why we didn't. For now, let's just go back to our main program, and oops, it can no longer find the myObject class. Why is this? Well, now it's in a completely different project. It's in the main solution, but it's still in a different project, which means it's no idea where the my object is. Now what we could do is, if we go to my object, you will notice that the namespace is my library. So the namespace is the name of our project. Similarly, in the playground project, the namespace is playground. Now, namespaces are about being able to manage code that are in different libraries without them causing conflicts with each other. What do I mean by this? Well, first of all, one way we could fix this is we could change the namespace to playground, and then what we can do within the playground project, if we right click preferences and right click references and click add reference, we have this option to choose solution, and as you can see, the my library project appears here. So we'll simply select that and say OK. Now what's that doing? Well, what that is doing is it's telling the my project, the playground project, that it wants to reference this project here. We'll go into a bit more detail, but for now, if you want to reference another project within the solution, that's how you link the two together. So what we need to do now is, if we compile, so if we do a build, and one final change we need to make to my object is, just as we made the methods and properties public here, we need to make the class itself public now because it's a different solution. Again, we'll come on to the reasons why you do and don't have public in a minute. But if we look now, so now it's gone back green, and it will allow us to build our solution again. And as you can see, that all works great. But we made it work by changing the namespace to the same namespace as our playground project. Now that is actually a very, very bad idea, and I'll explain why. Let's say we were to create another library. And let's again create another object called my object. And again, we'll copy and paste the code in. Oops. In fact, to tell you what we'll do, we'll do it the easy way. What we can do is, if we just copy that file directly in. So now we've got my object. It's the same namespace again. So we've got two classes called my object, and they're both in the playground namespace. Again, if we go into that playground and add a reference to the other project, now when we try to build the solution, it fails. Now the reason why is, if we look down here, we can see my object exists in both of these two libraries, and that's the problem. We have now a conflict. We've got two objects in the same namespace of the same name, and we don't know which one we want to use. And obviously this is not a good way forward, because what might happen is you might write an object and you pass that object to another team, to another company, to another developer who wants to use your solution and your code, and if they bring it in and they've named an object the same in the same namespace, they're going to conflict and it's not going to work. So what do we do? Well, basically this is why we have namespaces. So if we go back into each of our objects and we change the namespace to what it should be, so in this case the namespace should be my second library, and in this one we shall call it my library. Well, now when we go to program, it's not there at all, but because we have a reference within the project, it knows where it should be. All we need to do is add a link to the namespace that we're using. So if we right click on our object, we have this resolve option, and as you can see, we've got using my library or my second library. So as you can see, we can now choose which one we want to use, and if we choose my library, what it does, it puts up here a statement saying using my library, and that is telling my program that it wants to use the my library namespace to try and find any objects. So it looks in there and it finds my object, and now it allows us to build it. However, we might actually want to use the my object from the two different libraries. So if that's the case, if we get rid of the using statement, what we do instead is we start typing in the namespace. So we type my library dot, and now we have my object. So that is referencing the my object in the namespace of my library. Similarly, for this one, we want to use my second library dot my object, and we just need to copy that to there, copy that new statement to there, and again, now the entire application builds, and this object is using the class from my library, this object, this variable is using the object from my second library. So we're able to have two classes that are the same name, but they'll happily work dependently with each other simply by having them in a different namespace. Now in the real world, you will generally call your namespaces and your projects based around your company name. That helps separate your namespaces between other companies that might use them. And a common method for doing this would be using something that's unique to your company. So for example, a domain name that is registered to you. So for example, in my case, what I would generally do is when I create a new project and I want to create a class library that I know I'm going to want to share with a company or a developer outside my own company, I will actually call the library com.square connection dot my library, because I own the squareconnection.com domain, therefore it is unique to myself. Again, let's just copy the my object into there, go in and change the namespace to com.squareconnection.mylibrary and build that. And once again, we will simply add a reference to that. And so now, when I'm wanting to access the objects, let's change that. Dot square connection dot my library dot my object equals new square connection dot my library dot my object. So checked 3. So as you can see, I've done the same thing here, but my namespace is much more verbose because I've started using my company name. Rebuild the program. Now if we right click my programs, the playground, and say open folder in File Explorer, we'll have this bin folder, so whenever you do a build it actually compiles everything and puts them in the bin folder. So we'll see we've got my library.dll, my second library.dll, because they were just in a basic namespace, it's not very easy to know what they are. But this one, comp.squareconnection.mylibrary, that means when I move that around now, I have a much greater chance that it isn't going to cause any conflicts. So to finish off about projects, I want to show you how you would consume or pass around this object we've just created. So in this case here, we've actually created this squareconnection.com and it's in the solution, and we linked it by going to references, add reference and solution. But we might not be in the solution. We may have compiled this and created it all on its own, and we need to bring it in separately. So if we build that and open the folder, just because I'm going to want to get to the DLL file, and then we're going to remove that from the project. So if we go to our program now and try to build, you'll see it doesn't like it because it can't find that namespace. What we need to do is in references say add reference, but instead of selecting a solution, we want to click browse and then the browse button there. And what we want to do is we want to browse to the location of our file, so we can see our DLL library here, and click OK. So we're linked to it there, and as you can see, it's now working again. So in this scenario, this is when you would create your standalone library, and then you would give it to a third party who would simply add it as a reference by referencing the actual DLL file, and then once they have that DLL file, they can access everything within the code and the structure that you've created.